Welcome. We appreciate your interest in what we have to say. Last Friday night, I had the opportunity to give a Bible study in a go-to-meeting type of environment. It's available on the website called thinkgod.org. It's put out by the Congregational Fellowship of God, which is based in Hartford, Wisconsin. So thanks to them for the opportunity to serve in that way, I always enjoy teaching the Bible. Today you're going to get a lesson in biblical mathematics, but first I have to see if you're ready, if you're capable of doing the math. So I teach English to immigrants who come to America, and also at times to foreign students who are trying to take time to learn the English language because they want to study in America. One thing I tell my students is to get them used to thinking in terms of math in English. So I tell them, you're 40 years old. You want to marry a girl who is 10. So I ask them, is it a good idea? And they say, no, right? No, it's not a good idea. You're 40 and she's 10. You're 4 times older than that girl. So then I tell you, okay, wait 5 years. Now you're 45 and she's 15. Now you're only 3 times older than that girl. So I tell them, now wait 15 years. Now you're 60 and she's 30. Now you're only twice as old as that girl. And then I ask them, how long do you have to wait? Now some of you are thinking, well, she's liable to pass me, and then she'll have to wait for me. I was nice enough to wait for her. But if you answered forever, you got the answer right, and you know enough math to follow what I'm going to talk about today. So if that confused you, don't worry about it. I'm calling this talk, Be Nifty, Counting 50. Be Nifty, Counting 50. We have a festival coming up now called Pentecost, or the 50th, meaning the 50th day. And it's the one festival that has to be counted. So it's a very special festival because we have to read the instructions and have enough respect for the Bible to put the data together and with great care to establish how the count ought to take place. Last week I pointed out that, well, I'm going to point it out even more specifically now, that about 20 years after Paul's conversion, he wrote to a church in Corinth, and they were Gentiles, pretty much. It was Greek, in Corinth in Greece. And he said to them in 1 Corinthians 16:7, for I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you if the Lord permits. But I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost. So he was talking about Pentecost to this church of Corinthians who were, a Gentile congregation. And he said he was going to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. And that was about 20 years after his conversion. I want to go now to the book of Acts, the 20th chapter. And this is about 30 years after his conversion. And here Luke is writing, his physician, his personal physician, who was probably a Gentile, writing to an audience predominantly Gentile. And in Acts 20, in verse 16, he says, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So you see that it was important for him to be in Jerusalem on Pentecost, and that was, as I said, 3 decades after his conversion, and Luke is writing about it as a Gentile writing to a Gentile audience. And so you find that in mainstream Christianity, Pentecost is generally observed. However, it's observed on different days because of differences in how to count it. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to put the biblical data together so that we can be nifty, counting 50. Now first, let's get some basic concepts in mind that ought to make sense. The festival of unleavened bread occurs at the beginning of the grain harvest, the first grain being the barley harvest. So during the festival of unleavened bread, an offering is made of the first fruits of the barley harvest. An amount called an omer is waved, it's lifted up. It's called the wave sheaf. in the Bible. And that is during the days of unleavened bread, the first fruits of the barley harvest. Now that is linked then to the next festival, which is another early grain harvest, in this case the wheat harvest. So the first fruits of the wheat harvest are brought during the next festival. So there's a parallel. You have the barley harvest, first fruits are brought during the days of unleavened bread. Then we have the wheat harvest, where the grain is, the first fruits of wheat are brought during the next festival. And they are connected. And you begin counting to that festival from the day that you offered the barley. So from the time you offer the first fruits of the barley, you count towards the next festival. Now there are going to be some years where you will offer that wave sheaf on a holy day, the first day of unleavened bread, and a direct parallel with offering the first fruits of the wheat harvest on Pentecost. During other years, you'll be offering it at least during the festival of unleavened bread, not on the holy day, but during the festival. And then during the next festival, you'll be offering the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And we understand that the first fruits of the barley harvest picture the risen Christ. He is the first fruits of all humanity, the first person resurrected to immortal life. Then we understand that the first fruits of the wheat harvest represent the resurrected saints, the church, the first fruits of humanity. As Jesus returns there resurrected to serve as his ruling team, bringing about the kingdom of God on earth, peace, prosperity, liberation for humankind. And so there's a great spiritual message in these days. And in fact, if you look at John 21, you'll find that when Jesus was resurrected, and of course everybody would have to say, if they believe the biblical account, that it was during the days of unleavened bread that he was resurrected. If you look at, did I say John 21? I meant to say John 20. In John 20, when he meets Mary Magdalene, she wants to grab him, and he says to her, this is John 20 verse 17, Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." He's speaking as a resurrected man who has to return to divinity. But he is now resurrected to immortality, and he's now going to ascend. Now he said that in the morning. He said that on a Sunday morning when they would be offering the wave sheaf in the temple. So as they lifted up the wave sheaf, Jesus was ascending. He is the antitype of the wave sheaf. And when he returns, he will resurrect his church, and they are the antitype of the first fruits of the wheat harvest that were also waved. If you look at Leviticus 23, they're also lifted up, the 2 loaves of wheat bread that were offered during Pentecost. So let's now discuss how to count towards Pentecost. We understand the Bible says to count, and how should we do it? And we understand the importance of connecting the 2 festivals, linking them together. And we see the symbolism in what happened with Jesus Christ. And then, of course, the Holy Spirit came on Pentecost. And some of these points I covered last week, so you can maybe delve into it by checking out that Bible study. But I want to go to Leviticus 23, and let's just be quite objective and quite respectful of the text. Leviticus 23. You know, when I came into the church, the first festival that I kept was the Festival of Pentecost back in 1968. And in 1984, the first festival I observed as a minister in the church was Pentecost. And in fact, this year, Pentecost falls on the 6th of Sivan, which is the anniversary of when I was ordained. Now, when I was a young man and first coming to church, I was coming out of the yeshiva world, the world of the ultra-Orthodox Talmudic students, and I would have really appreciated this translation of the New Testament. I hope you're seeing this on the screen. What I have in front of me is called the Orthodox Jewish Brit Chadashah. This belongs to my daughter Rachel, and she's loaning it to me for the time being. But this is written in a kind of in-speak, the kind of in-speak used by ultra-Orthodox Jews who come from the heritage of the Lithuanian rabbinical schools, or even the Hasidic tradition, where they speak to one another often in the Yiddish language, or in a mixture of English and Yiddish, also using Hebrew terminology out of the Bible and Aramaic terminology out of the Talmud. So this is a translation of the New Testament using this ultra-Orthodox in-speak. Now, I don't know how many people are reading it, but I really would have enjoyed it when I was younger. But it's called the Orthodox Jewish Brit Chadashah, if any of you want to check it out. But in order to understand it, you have to kind of be part of that world. But at the end of the book, there's this glossary, page after page, of terms that they have to define, for those who are breaking into that kind of language. But anyway, to get back onto the main theme here, in Leviticus 23, what is the first thing that's talked about? The first institution that's talked about is the weekly Sabbath. So let's keep that in mind. The first institution talked about here is the weekly Sabbath. I'm speaking to you. I'm being recorded on a weekly Sabbath. This is the 6th day of the second month. During this week, Israel celebrated 68 years of its existence. And this is now the 6th day of the second month, and we're now 21 days counting towards Pentecost, which is going to be the 50th day, and we're now on day 21 counting. But in Leviticus 23, the first institution talked about is the Sabbath. What's the next one? The next one is the Passover, the day that the lamb was slaughtered. Let's understand that the whole festival season begins critically with that. And think of the spiritual lesson there. We become reconciled to God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So the Passover sacrifice, the sacrifice of the lamb, begins the festival season. It is essential. What happens is, as you know, or should know, the lamb was sacrificed at the end of the 14th to be eaten to begin the festival. The festival would have been the 15th. We have that night, the night to be much observed, what the Jews call the Seder night. And in ancient times in Jerusalem, that's the night that the lamb would have been eaten. And it had to be slaughtered at the end of the 14th and eaten on the 15th to begin the festival. So the 14th day of the first month is the day of the Passover, the day of the slaughtering of the lamb. And it was the day on which Jesus Christ died. Now, we don't have the Passover sacrifice anymore, but we do have a ceremony to replace it. It is just that important. Remember, it was commanded to the Israelites before they ever left Egypt. And it's just that important. And so we have a ceremony to replace it. The New Testament Passover, which is often called the Lord's Supper. And we keep it indeed on the 14th day of the first month, the day that Jesus Christ died. But we keep it on the beginning of the 14th. His sacrifice began on the beginning of the 14th. Yes, he died at 3 o'clock, but he began to suffer that night. He was betrayed, arrested, humiliated, tortured, verbally and physically abused, and finally crucified and died at 3 o'clock. But the trial began really that evening. And that's when we begin to think about it, and we keep the Lord's Supper or the New Testament Passover at that time. So that's the beginning of the festival season, the 14th day of the first month. And that's the next institution that's mentioned. If you just read the account, you have the Sabbath, and then you have the Passover. Then the next event that's mentioned is the festival of unleavened bread. And during that festival, then, you would offer the wave sheaf, the omer, the first fruits of the barley harvest. And when would you offer them? Well, it tells you the day after the Sabbath. Well, the Sabbath, we know, is the seventh day. And we know that we have a festival season beginning with the killing of the lamb on the 14th day of the first month. So that means, in effect, to put it in modern English, the first unleavened Sunday is when you offer the wave sheaf. The first unleavened Sunday. That means some years it will be on the first day of unleavened bread, which is a holy day. On other years, it will be like such this year. It will be not on a holy day, but it will be on a day during the festival. And then that day is day number 1 in counting towards the time you bring the next offering. So that ought to be clear. So we're now going to pick it up in Leviticus 23 and I'll pick it up around, where do I want to go? Verse 15. Well, let's go back to verse 9. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted on your behalf on the day after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it. So as I said, the Sabbath has been defined as what the day we call Saturday. But when is he going to do it? Well, we've just been talking about the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. So that's when he'd be doing it. As I said, on the first unleavened Sunday. And you shall offer and then as we go farther, let's go to verse 14. You weren't allowed to eat of the harvest until this offering was brought. That's something to keep in mind, as you'll see later. You shall not eat. This is verse 14. You shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. So while the temple stood, while sacrifices were being offered, you had to wait until that sacrifice was brought before you could eat of that harvest. And you shall count, this is in verse 15 now, and you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf to the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. So you're going to have 7 Saturdays, 7 weeks, and of course Saturday is the last day of the week. It's the 7th day of the week. So you're going to have 7 complete Saturdays, or 49 days. So the next day then is the first day of the week, or a Sunday. And that's the 50th day. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Eternal. Now, one way to solidify our understanding of this is to look at Joshua 5 and verse 10. Joshua 5 and verse 10. Here they have come to the promised land, as Deuteronomy told them they would. And now it's time to eat of the grain. Eventually the manna that was keeping them alive is going to stop. And they're going to have to live like normal people live, harvesting grain, and not depending on some supernatural sustenance, but actually harvesting grain. So they cross the Jordan. They are circumcised so that they can keep the Passover. And then in verse 10, now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. So at the end of the day, they killed their lambs, because that night they were going to eat them, roast them, and eat them. So they killed them at the end of the 14th, as they were supposed to do. That was the Passover day. And verse 11, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain, on the very same day. Now that expression is interesting, because that expression is used for the first day of unleavened bread, the day they left Egypt. If you go back to Exodus 12, and it goes back to an expression in Genesis 17, Abraham and Ishmael and the household were circumcised, and the expression says on that very same day. So probably the Israelites left Egypt 430 years later on that same day, the same day. That's the day they left Egypt, 430 years after the circumcision of Abraham and his household. If we go to Exodus 12, and you can go back to Genesis 17 and see that expression used twice as Abraham is circumcised. But I want to go to Exodus 12, and here as they're leaving Egypt, that expression comes up. Verse 41, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years. This is 430 years from the time of Abraham's circumcision. All that time, the Israelites were strangers. They were not in control of Canaan. They were not in control of Egypt. They were always subject to somebody else. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Eternal went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Eternal for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the night of the Eternal, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. And I know many of you observed it recently. And now we come to Joshua 5, and we see on that very same day, they ate grain, but of course it was unleavened. Let's go to verse 11 of Joshua 5. Are you back there now? Joshua 5:11. They've crossed the Jordan. They've been circumcised. They've kept the Passover. And now they're going to eat it. But they have to eat it with unleavened bread is the commandment. And of course that night, unleavened bread and bitter herbs, if you remember. But in Joshua 5:11, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. So you see that if they did that, how do you do that if you have not offered the wave sheaf? You're supposed to offer the wave sheaf before you eat produce. And so they offered the wave sheaf that day because it was Sunday, evidently that year. In other words, that year, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are listening to this, that year, the Passover lamb was slaughtered on a weekly Sabbath. The 14th day of the first month was a Saturday. That happens from time to time. Sometimes we keep the Passover, the New Testament Passover, the Lord's Supper, on a Friday evening. This year we didn't, but some years we do. And if that were to happen, the lamb would be slaughtered that Sabbath. Other sacrifices are offered on the Sabbath. Every Sabbath there are sacrifices. And as you know, if a child has to be circumcised on the Sabbath, the child is circumcised on the Sabbath. And so the Passover lamb was sacrificed on the Sabbath. Now the next day would have been Sunday, the first day of the week, but it was also the first day of the festival. It was a holy day, but also it was the day they would have offered the wave sheaf that year. It was the morrow after the Sabbath during that season. The season begins with the 14th day of the first month when the lamb is slaughtered. That kicks off the whole season. You have to have that before you can do anything else. And even to this day, the church to this day has a special observance on the 14th day of the first month. And so the 14th day is the beginning of the season, of the festival season. And so the next day, if it's a Sunday, then it's a holy day, first day of unleavened bread. So that means Saturday night would be a night to be much observed, the Seder night, and or Leil Shimurim in the Hebrew. The original Hebrew is Leil Shimurim, which they translate, a night of solemn observance. They translated that in the Bible I just read. So anyway, that Sunday then, they would have offered the wave sheaf. Now, the Old King James translation, maybe some of you are still using it. Maybe some of you have an Old King James translation in front of you. They were faced with a difficulty because the Sadducees were keeping Pentecost, in my opinion, incorrectly. What the Sadducees ignored or didn't consider was that the 14th day of the first month, when the lamb was slaughtered, ought to be considered the first day of the season. They didn't do that. They decided that they would ignore that, and the season begins on the 15th. So if the 15th day of the 15th day of the first month is a Sunday, well then they have to wait till the end of the festival for that Saturday, and then the next day, Sunday, they do the offering. And that's outside the festival. So they're actually offering the offering outside the festival, not within the festival. And in effect, they're keeping it a week late. But that was the Sadducee custom. And the New King James and the Old King James evidently decided that was the correct way to understand it. And so they added the word old in here. So if you have an Old King James Bible, originally going back to 1611, it says, "And they ate of the old produce." I think it adds the word old in italics, but it's not in the original. But they were forced to put that in because of a problem that they had. But it doesn't belong there. They ate of the produce of the land, and it's quite and if we think about it, we can understand why. Because the first day of unleavened bread that year must have been a Sunday. The Sabbath was when they killed the lamb. The next day was a Sunday, the morrow after the Sabbath, as Leviticus 23 tells us. They offered the wave sheaf. They ate unleavened bread, or made of barley, and they were able to begin counting then towards Pentecost that year. And so everything works fine if you put all the scriptures together and respect the text. Now, you can further see that if you go to Luke, the 6th chapter. Here is a text that is problematic, and some people have amended it. But I think if you talk to a Bible scholar, you know what they would tell you? They will tell you that usually the most difficult text is the original one. In other words, when people came to a difficult text, they would amend it and edit it. So the edited texts are probably not the original ones. The original ones are the ones that give you trouble. And Luke 6:1 gave some people trouble. So they edited it. But if you go back to the original text, which the New King James preserves and the Old King James preserves, here's how they deal with it. Okay? Luke 6 and verse 1. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. This was probably barley here because of the season. The second Sabbath after the first? What's going on there? Well, if you look at the Greek, it says the second first Sabbath. Now, what kind of Sabbath could be called a second first Sabbath? Well, let's use our heads. Is there a Sabbath that could be called a second first Sabbath? Yes, because the Sadducees, as I said, waited a week and started counting Pentecost on the Sunday after the festival was over. So for them, when you go one more week, that would be the first week. But for those who are doing it properly, in my opinion, based upon the scriptures, those who kept the festival of unleavened bread on that Sunday and also offered the wave sheaf on that Sunday, for them it was the second Sabbath counting towards Pentecost. So in effect, what we have here is the Sabbath, which is the 28th day of the first month. The 28th day of the first month. The 14th day of the first month was a Saturday. That was the day that the lamb was slaughtered. The next day was the 15th. That's when the wave sheaf should have been offered. And according to some people, evidently they did offer it then, or at least they believed they should start counting then. If they didn't have the power to offer the lamb then, at least they had the power to start counting then. And then another Sabbath went by, and that would be then the first Sabbath counting towards Pentecost, and then came the 28th, 2 weeks later, which was the second Sabbath. But for the Sadducees, they had offered the lamb a week later, and they had started counting a week later. For them, it was the first Sabbath, so it was the second first Sabbath. Now, this is internal evidence that there were Jews in the first century, or that at least those Jews who were part of the Church of God, who were keeping Pentecost as I've explained it. This is internal evidence in the New Testament text that there was a view different from the Sadducees, that there were those for whom the 28th day of Nisan was the second Sabbath rather than the first one. It's internal evidence that there was a perspective on Pentecost in those days. And so we do have in that sense evidence that tradition goes back all that far. The Talmud doesn't talk about it. The Talmud covers the Pharisees' tradition of keeping on the sixth day of the third month, and the Talmud preserves the Sadducee tradition of keeping it on a Sunday, but starting it when the first day of unleavened bread is a Sunday, starting it after the festival is over, which the Pharisees, of course, criticized. On the other hand, the Sadducees criticized the Pharisees for keeping it on a fixed date of the month, because you're supposed to count to get there. And yet they always fixed it on the sixth day of the third month. So they had their problems as well. Both sides had problems. If they had only done it the way I'm explaining it to you, everything would have been fine. It would have been always kept during the festival and always counted. And so that third way was evidently in practice in those days, and is practiced now by the church. There's even another way to do it. The Ethiopian Jews used to wait till the festival was over every year and count Pentecost always on the 12th day of the third month. That custom is probably going to be dying out. All the Ethiopian Jews now pretty much are living in Israel and probably assimilating, and so that custom will probably die out. Okay, so is everybody with me? If you put all the data together, if you read Leviticus 23 carefully, if you read Joshua 5, if you read Luke 6, you put all the data together, then you'll understand Pentecost comes out on a Sunday, but it comes out on the first unleavened Sunday that you come to. That when you keep the festival of unleavened bread, when you come to a Sunday during that festival, that's when you start counting towards Pentecost, and it comes out on a Sunday after 7 weeks. 7 Sabbaths are complete. Then it comes out on the 50th day, which is a Sunday. So if you put all the data together and have respect for the text and see the parallelism and see the typology there, it all is mutually reinforcing, And it gives you a way of counting 50 where you can be confident that you're keeping Pentecost appropriately. Now I want to go to Acts, the second chapter. In Acts, the second chapter, here we see that the church began with people who were devout people, it says. They were commandment-keeping people. They were there in Jerusalem on Pentecost, keeping Pentecost. And on that Pentecost, that was the birthday of the church. In Acts 2, it's when the day of Pentecost had fully come. So we're not talking about the evening before, but we're talking about the actual day of Pentecost when the offering was made of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And if you keep reading, you'll see it was 9 o'clock in the morning. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And then you have 7 miracles that occur on that day to launch the New Testament church. Pentecost, we have the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and a jump start, a very exciting, dramatic jump start to the church, where we have the 120 disciples growing to 3,000 in one day, a multiple of 25 times that 120, I believe. So we have that very exciting beginning of the New Testament church. And so the church now understands how to properly count Pentecost. We can be confident that we're keeping it appropriately, and we can now understand why I'm giving you that advice. Be nifty, counting 50. I hope that this brief covering of this material has been of help to you, and that if you have further questions or comments, I'd appreciate your input. And since many of you will be watching this on the Sabbath, enjoy the rest of your Sabbath, or whenever you watch it. I hope you benefit from this presentation. All the best to you and yours.